Content warning. This episode discusses death and allegations of domestic homicide. Listener discretion is advised. On the 22nd of October, 2003, 48 nautical miles off the coast of Townsville, Australia, a dive boat sat anchored above one of the most famous wrecked dives in the world, the SS Yongala, a passenger steamer that had gone down in a cyclone nearly a century earlier, now home to an extraordinary array of marine life on the floor of the Great Barrier Reef. Two American newlyweds went down into the water that morning. Only one of them came back up under his own power. 11 days into her marriage, 26-year-old Tina Watson drowned at a depth of around 16 meters in warm, clear water on a dive her husband would later describe as going wrong in a matter of minutes. He surfaced alone to call for help. By the time another diver brought her body back to the surface, it was too late. What followed was one of the strangest, most drawn-out legal sagas in recent memory, spanning two countries, two entirely different criminal justice systems, a guilty plea to one charge, a not guilty plea to a much more serious one, and, in the end, a verdict that left almost nobody satisfied. Was Tina Watson's death a tragic accident, the kind of thing that happens more often than most recreational divers like to think about? Or did the man she'd married just 11 days earlier use a wreck dive on their honeymoon to carry out something far more calculated? Part 1. Tina Christina Mee Watson, known to almost everyone in her life as Tina, was born in what was then West Germany before her family relocated to the United States while she was still young. She was adopted by Tommy and Cindy Thomas and grew up moving between Louisiana and Alabama before the family eventually settled in Birmingham. By the early 2000s, Tina was a student at the University of Alabama, described by those who knew her as warm, close with her family, and genuinely excited about the future she was building for herself. It was at university that she met David Gabriel Watson, known to everyone as Gabe. The two began dating, became engaged, and on the 11th of October 2003, they were married in a wedding surrounded by family and friends in Alabama. For their honeymoon, the newlyweds planned something that reflected a shared enthusiasm for scuba diving. A trip to Australia built around several days of diving on the Great Barrier Reef, widely considered one of the greatest diving destinations anywhere on Earth. They flew first to Sydney, spending roughly a week there before traveling north to Townsville in Queensland, the gateway to one of the most sought-after wreck dives in the world, the SS Yongala. The Yongala had sunk during a cyclone in 1911, and over the following decades had become an extraordinary, thriving artificial reef, home to sea snakes, manta rays, and enormous groupers, drawing experienced divers from all over the globe. It's also, by the consistent account of dive operators and safety literature about the site, a genuinely demanding dive, deep, prone to strong currents, and not typically recommended for divers without a reasonable amount of open water experience. On the morning of the 22nd of October 2003, just 11 days after their wedding, Gabe and Tina Watson went down together to the wreck of the Yongala. Part 2. What happened underwater according to Gabe Watson's own account, given repeatedly to police and investigators in the years that followed. The dive began to go wrong within its first few minutes. He described strong currents at depth, stronger than either of them had anticipated, and said that Tina had begun to show signs of distress fairly early into the dive. In his telling, he moved to help her, attempting to bring her back toward the descent line they'd used to reach the wreck. And in the course of that assistance, Tina, in a moment of panic, accidentally knocked his mask and regulator loose. By the time Gabe had cleared his mask and regained his own vision and air supply, he said, Tina was already sinking, and he made the decision to surface alone to call for help rather than continue trying to reach her at depth. Other divers in the water that day gave investigators their own accounts of what they'd witnessed. One dive instructor present, Wade Singleton, would later retrieve Tina's body from the seafloor and spend approximately 45 minutes attempting to resuscitate her aboard the support vessel, alongside a doctor who happened to be on the boat that day, efforts that ultimately could not save her. A photograph taken by another diver in the water that morning would go on to become one of the case's most haunting and widely circulated pieces of evidence. An image that had inadvertently captured Tina in the background, lying motionless on the ocean floor, arms splayed, entirely alone. An autopsy conducted the following day by Queensland pathologists confirmed that Tina had died by drowning, with findings also noting pulmonary barotrauma, lung injury consistent with a rapid, uncontrolled ascent, and evidence of air embolism. In the most immediate clinical sense, there was no real dispute about the mechanism of Tina Watson's death. What there was, almost from the very beginning, was serious and mounting dispute about how she had come to be in that position in the first place. Part 3. A growing suspicion in the days immediately following Tina's death. What had happened on the Yongala dive was treated, largely, as exactly what it appeared to be on the surface. A tragic diving accident, the kind that happens with genuine, if statistically uncommon, regularity to recreational divers around the world, particularly at technically demanding sites. Gabe returned to the United States. Tina was buried at Southern Heritage Cemetery in Pelham, Alabama. But questions about the case didn't go away. In fact, over the following years, they grew louder, driven in large part by Tina's own family, who made clear, publicly and repeatedly, that they didn't believe the official account of what had happened to their daughter added up. By 2006, that mistrust had become public enough to draw renewed attention from investigators on both sides of the Pacific. In 2007, the FBI, working alongside the Helena Police Department in Alabama, executed a search of Gabe Watson's home, seizing computers and documents as part of a reopened, far more serious inquiry into what had actually happened on that dive. Several specific details emerged during that renewed investigation that significantly complicated the simple accident narrative. Tina's father, Tommy Thomas, told investigators that shortly before the wedding, Gabe had asked Tina to increase her life insurance coverage and to make him the sole beneficiary, a request Tina had apparently discussed with her family, and which, according to the record established at the subsequent inquest, she had not actually gone through with before her death. Investigators also uncovered inconsistencies between Gabe's various retellings of the dive over the years and other physical and witness evidence, including contested claims about signaling to another diver underwater, which that diver's own testimony did not appear to support. And then there was Gabe's dive computer, a small device, worn like an oversized watch, that records precise data about a diver's depth, timing, and movements throughout a dive. Australian investigators considered it a potentially crucial piece of physical evidence, capable of independently verifying or contradicting Gabe's account of exactly how the dive had unfolded, minute by minute. According to an Australian police officer who later testified about the initial interview process, Gabe had been calm and provided a great deal of detail when first describing what happened, but became noticeably agitated when told police intended to retain his dive computer for examination. Part 4. An inquest and an indictment. The renewed Australian investigation culminated in a lengthy coronial inquest, presided over by Townsville coroner David Glasgow, that stretched across roughly 4.5 weeks of hearings. Gabe Watson did not testify in person at the inquest, invoking privilege against potential self-incrimination, though he had already given multiple videotaped interviews to police in the years prior, and continued to participate in the process through his legal representatives. During those hearings, prosecutors laid out a considerably more troubling theory of what might have happened on the Yongala, suggesting, based on painstaking underwater reenactments carried out by police divers, that it was possible Gabe had turned off Tina's air supply, held her in what would later be widely, if inaccurately, reported in some press coverage as an underwater bear hug, until she lost consciousness, and then turned her air back on before allowing her to sink. It's worth being precise here about what the coroner actually found, because this detail has been persistently misreported in the years since. Sensational headlines at the time suggested the coroner had definitively concluded Gabe deliberately killed Tina by cutting off her air supply and restraining her. But the coroner's own written findings never actually stated that as a factual conclusion. What Coroner Glasgow did determine, after weighing the full body of evidence presented across those 4.5 weeks, was that there was sufficient evidence of possible foul play to warrant Gabe Watson being formally charged with murder and committed to stand trial, a significantly different and more measured threshold than a definitive finding of how Tina actually died. On the 19th of June 2008, the coroner formally laid the charge that on the 22nd of October 2003, at the site of the Yongala wreck, David Gabriel Watson had murdered Christina Mee Watson. Extradition proceedings followed, and in May of 2009, Gabe Watson traveled voluntarily from the United States back to Australia to face trial. Part 5. A guilty plea to a lesser charge rather than proceeding to a full murder trial, Gabe Watson ultimately entered a guilty plea in the Australian courts, not to murder, but to the considerably lesser charge of manslaughter, specifically framed around a negligent failure to do enough to save his wife once she began experiencing difficulty during the dive. In doing so, Watson maintained consistently that he had not deliberately harmed Tina in any way, but acknowledged that his response to her distress underwater had fallen seriously short of what a certified rescue diver, which he was, should reasonably have been capable of doing to save her. It's a detail that drew considerable scrutiny during the proceedings and has continued to draw scrutiny ever since. Gabe Watson held not just an open water certification, but qualifications as an advanced diver, a rescue diver, and a specialty diver. Rescue diver training specifically, as a certification, is built around exactly the kind of scenario he described encountering. Recognizing the signs of a panicking dive buddy, managing that panic, and executing techniques to bring a distressed diver safely back to the surface. For a diver with that level of formal training to lose his wife in comparatively benign, clear, warm water at a depth well within recreational diving limits struck many observers, including members of the prosecution, as difficult to reconcile with his account of a straightforward, unavoidable accident. In 2009, Gabe Watson was sentenced to 18 months in an Australian prison for the manslaughter of his wife. It was, for many people following the case, and especially for Tina's family, a conclusion that felt entirely inadequate to the scale of what they believed had actually happened on that dive. Part 6. A second prosecution. In a second country, Alabama authorities were not willing to let the matter rest there. Alabama's Attorney General at the time, Troy King, argued publicly and forcefully that Australian authorities had shown Gabe Watson far too much leniency and pursued an entirely separate legal theory, that Watson had actually devised the plan to kill his wife while still in Alabama, prior to the honeymoon, a legal argument that, if it could be established, would give Alabama its own independent jurisdiction to charge him with capital murder, entirely separate from whatever. Australia, a country firmly and consistently opposed to capital punishment, agreed to release the full case file and supporting evidence to American authorities, but only on the condition that the United States formally pledge not to seek the death penalty against Watson if he were convicted in Alabama. With that assurance secured, Gabe Watson, upon his release from Australian custody and subsequent deportation, was extradited to face capital murder charges in his home state. He pleaded not guilty. The case proceeded to trial in Birmingham, Alabama, in February of 2012, nearly a decade after Tina's death, and roughly a full media generation into the case, having earned Gabe Watson the enduring, unflattering tabloid nickname of the honeymoon killer. Part 7. The Alabama trial. The Alabama prosecution built its case around the same broad, circumstantial themes that had shaped the earlier Australian inquest. Watson's extensive dive training set against his apparent failure to execute basic rescue techniques, the pre-wedding conversation about increasing and redirecting Tina's life insurance, and what prosecutors characterized as a pattern of inconsistency across Watson's various retellings of the dive over the better. The photograph of Tina lying motionless on the ocean floor was entered into evidence, alongside Watson's own recorded police interviews from years earlier, proceedings during which, according to reporting from inside the courtroom, Watson visibly teared up while watching himself recount the events of that October morning. Prosecutors called witnesses, including Dr. Stanley Stutz, who had witnessed Tina's final moments in the water and testified that she hadn't been thrashing or showing any real energy, that she simply didn't have the strength left to swim. But when it came to actually proving murder, establishing beyond a reasonable doubt that Gabe Watson had deliberately and intentionally caused his wife's death, rather than simply failed through panic, poor judgment, or a genuine accident to save her, the prosecution's case ran into serious trouble. The only person who had actually witnessed events underwater in any real detail was Gabe himself, and even the state's own witnesses offered testimony that, at points, actively supported the idea that he had, in fact, been trying to help Tina rather than harm her. After roughly 2 weeks of trial, the presiding federal judge made the decision to acquit Gabe Watson before the case was ever handed to the jury for deliberation, ruling that prosecutors had simply failed to present sufficient evidence to sustain a murder conviction. It was, in legal terms, a directed verdict, a judge's determination that no reasonable jury, even viewing the evidence in the most favorable possible light for the prosecution, could find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt on the charges as presented. For Tina's family, after close to 9 years of investigations, an inquest, an extradition, a guilty plea to what they'd always considered an inadequate charge in Australia, and now an acquittal in Alabama before American jurors had even had the chance to weigh in, it was an almost unbearable final outcome. The American criminal justice system's final word on the death of Tina Watson was, in the end, no conviction at all. Part 8. A feud that outlasted the trials. The bitterness this case generated didn't end with the Alabama acquittal, and one specific, deeply uncomfortable incident from the years between the two trials illustrates just how personal and painful the conflict between Gabe Watson and Tina's family had become. Following Tina's burial in Alabama, her family placed flowers at her grave, and, in an apparent effort to protect them from being disturbed or removed, secured them to the ground near her headstone with a chain. Gabe Watson was subsequently caught on police surveillance footage, using bolt cutters to cut through that chain and remove the flowers from his late wife's grave, an act that, whatever explanation he may have offered for it, read to almost everyone who learned of it as a final, deliberate act of provocation aimed squarely at the family who had spent years publicly working to see him held accountable for Tina's death. It's a strange, uncomfortable footnote to sit with, in a case already defined by so much unresolved anger and suspicion. A reminder that beneath the layers of forensic argument, jurisdictional wrangling, and courtroom procedure, this was, underneath everything, a genuinely raw and personal family tragedy that never really found any kind of peaceful resolution for anyone involved. Part 9. What remains unresolved more than 2 decades on from that October morning at the Yongala wreck, the case of Tina Watson occupies a genuinely unusual space in the broader landscape of unresolved true crime cases. Because unlike so many of the cases we cover on this show, there's no real mystery here about who was present at the moment Tina died, or about the broad sequence of events that led to her drowning. The entire dispute, from the very first days of the reopened investigation all the way through to the Alabama acquittal, has always centered on a single, narrower, and ultimately unanswerable question. what was actually happening inside Gabe Watson's mind and inside his hands during those critical few minutes 16 meters below the surface of the Coral Sea. Was this a case of a panicked, undertrained response from a man who, whatever certifications hung on his wall, simply froze and made the wrong split-second decisions when his wife needed him most? Or was it something far colder and more calculated, a plan formed before the couple ever boarded their flight to Australia, executed in one of the only environments on Earth where it's genuinely difficult to definitively prove, after the fact, exactly what one diver did or didn't do to another? Australian authorities secured a manslaughter conviction built around negligence rather than intent. American authorities, working with an entirely different legal threshold and an entirely different jury pool, couldn't secure any conviction at all. Tina's own family have never wavered in their public conviction that her death was no accident. Christina Mee Watson was 26 years old. She'd been married for 11 days. She went into the water off the coast of Townsville on an ordinary, clear October morning, on what should have been one of the most joyful trips of her entire life, and never came back up on her own. More than 20 years later, despite two separate criminal justice systems, two separate prosecutions, and one guilty plea to a charge her own family always considered far too lenient, the full and complete truth of what happened to her in those final minutes underwater remains, in any legally definitive sense, unknown. Thank you for listening.